Hello, everyone. Here we're at the Industrial Conference on Data Mining 2021. My name is Mori Kabiri, and I'm here with Valentino Constantino to present our research on detecting anomalous invoice line items in the legal case lifecycle. First, I will be briefly going over who we are and what we do here at InfiniGlobe Research Lab, and then talk about the background and motivation for doing this research. After that, I will hand it over to Valentino to introduce himself and go over the method and experiments. And finally, he will explain the results and the next step for us. At InfiniGlobe, we help legal department of corporations to use software technology to optimize their processes and reduce cost. And during the past 2 decades, our principals have implemented matter management and electronic billing system for many large corporations. These corporations spend on average between $30 to $50 million on legal invoices. Now, as you may know, lawyers are known to be resistant to embrace new technologies such as AI, and that's historically. But I'm in contact and I've been talking with many legal department leaders during the past several years, and we have seen movements and showing interest in using AI, mainly to automate repetitive work. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the background and motivation about this research. Now, every year, US corporations spend around $80 billion on legal invoices for services such as litigation, patents, merger and acquisitions. Now, these legal invoices are very complex and intricate, often contains hundreds of line items for anything from hands-on legal work to expenses such as copying, meal, and travel. Normally, companies ask law firms to send their invoices electronically. So with the help of using software such as rule-based engines for e-billing softwares to audit them and make adjustments to these invoices automatically. Now, even with these safeguards in place, such as billing guidelines and using these rule-based e-billing tools, not all errors are detected. And sometimes due to the false positive outcome, companies either have to overpay or underpay law firms, not mentioning damage in the relationship. Now, companies spend a lot of time and money for high-paid attorneys to review these invoices manually, which is wasting a lot of their time instead of spending time on creative work. Now, that's why in our research lab and with the help of one of our clients, our goal in this research was to use machine learning and demonstrate the current flaws in the legal invoice review using traditional methods. Now with that, I'm going to hand it over to Valentino to introduce himself and explain a little bit about the structure of legal invoice and our approach in detail. Valentino?
Thank you, Maury. And, I appreciate everyone being here today. My name is Valentino Constantino, and I'm a data scientist, here at Infinity Research Lab. Thank you, Maury. You made a great introduction. And as you mentioned, I'll talk to you a little bit more here about the methodologies. So stepping a little bit into it, we'll talk a little bit about the format of the data and later on the methods that we used. Here is an example of a legal invoice. If you're familiar with relational data, this might look pretty familiar to you. Some of the columns that we have are the date, the type of expense, and that this line item of this invoice is. The timekeeper, which in the legal industry refers to the attorney or the other legal worker that's working on the case. The quantity, being the amount of time spent on that task or on the number of items of that expense, the rate or the cost, the total amount, the activity in the code. We'll go into the code here in a little bit later. So some of these invoices can have hundreds of line items. So you might imagine it can take a lot of time to review. And attorneys, as I mentioned before, the timekeepers, they tend to track and bill their work with great details, avoiding bulk hours. The codes indicate the type of work performed or the expense category. So you might see up there the code L190. That would be litigation 190, which corresponds to a particular type of work performed. So some of these codes are, you know, if you want to understand them a little bit better, they're called the Uniform Task-Based Management System, or UTBMS codes, and they were developed by the American Bar Association, the ABA, and the American Corporate Counsel Association. So, you know, with the knowledge of how these codes are encoded, they can reveal the ordering of activities or the distribution of certain activities throughout a legal case, showing the typical distribution of work at various stages of the case, whether it's at the beginning of the case or whether we're towards the close. However, these codes can be misused due to the lack of knowledge or time constraints, restricting their utility without invoice review. Our goal in this project was to detect a very specific type of anomaly that could be present within invoices and on line items within invoices, specifically those which are out of place according to the typical life cycle of a legal case. Meaning that given a certain attributes of a legal case, what is the typical distribution of UTBMS codes? And are any of the line items in any new cases that we're receiving out of place in regards to that typical distribution? So here's an example of just some of the UTBMS codes that are available. You'll see that there is, you know, an ordering or a structure to, you know, these codes. And this is just here a little bit of an example and just a small glimpse into the large breadth of codes that are available. But going back to and relating this back to our earlier work, detecting, you know, those that are out of place in regards to the project lifecycle, I'll move here on to the next slide and show you all a figure. Here's a figure of that visualizes the distributions in the UTBMS codes. So, you know, on the previous, you know, slide, I showed you a table that included some litigation type codes, you know, in the 100, 200, 300 categories and so on. Here on the right, we'll see that the 100 categories or L100s are red, the L200s are blue, L300s purple, and so on and so forth. What you'll see here is that a lot of these, you know, distributions, or there's like a typical distributions of some of the codes. The UTBMS codes indicate the phases of the litigation, and the distributions from the phases now can be mined from historical data, which is what I'm showing here. But however, we might have some out-of-place records according to the case lifecycle, which may represent an error in data entry, which we might want to flag, or something more serious that needs to be checked. These are the types of anomalies that we want to detect and present for review in the work that we're doing here. You might see here that, you know, we've got the days since project open here on the x-axis. And so that's how we're defining the distributions of the UTBMS codes, is where, how many days since the day the project started or the litigation started, the case started really, do these typical activities show up in the life cycle, and when are they out of place according to that value? So I'm going to move now into some of the more in detail into some of the methods and the experiments. The first thing is that we started with legal e-billing invoices that were available from our clients from InfiniGlobe. But one of the first things we had to do was identify suitable training data or legal cases that are, you know, quote, well-formed. What is well-formed? Well, these are legal cases that have a longer duration, maybe have a lot of activities, something where, you know, we can pretty easily assess whether something might be out of place. And so we needed to isolate these legal cases with the well-distributed phases, and we utilized a mix of dimensionality reduction and clustering approaches to isolate these line items that were suitable for our modeling problem. Our data was unlabeled, as well we needed an approach to overcome this challenge. The approach that we came up with was to use a combination of two dimensionality reduction approaches for the first step. These are singular value decomposition, or SVD, and then T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding, or TSNE, to reduce the data's dimensionality. We kept the number of principal components in the SVD to a number that would capture 95% of the variance of the data. And then after reducing the dimensionality with TSNE, we subsequently utilized DBSCAN DBSCAN clustering, which is a clustering algorithm, to isolate various groups of line items, which I'll show you here shortly. Subsequent examination of these clusters showed distinct charging patterns in each cluster, meaning they were all sort of unique. And one of these clusters contained line items that we thought were well distributed throughout the legal case lifecycle, and something that we could use in our experiments and our modeling problem. The result is here. And so this is the result of applying the singular value decomposition, the t-distributed stochastic neighbor embeddings, or t-SNE, and then applying the dbScan clustering. Cluster number 3, which included 340 observations that you see here in the red, was identified as a suitable candidate for model training. It contained line items that were well distributed throughout the legal case lifecycle. This is a part of the project that was a bit qualitative, we, as well as quantitative. It was something that we could see from the data, as well as something that we could describe with some summary statistics. I mentioned earlier that we had no labeled data. This problem was unlabeled, and while we suspected that some of these anomalies might exist in the data, we took a different approach to identifying them and training our approach, since the anomalies have well-defined characteristics, meaning we know exactly what characteristic can kind of describe this type of anomaly. And so we leveraged that subject matter expertise in order to generate synthetic data. So we know that line items with certain attributes are present at typical ranges within the legal case lifecycle, at a typical distribution within the lifecycle, and line items that's out of this expected range, might be considered, anomalous. And so, building off of some previous work that we identified through some literature review, we randomly sampled and replaced line items in the data. And during that replacement, we manipulated the number of days since project open so that it would occur much earlier in the project lifecycle than would be, typical with that kind of line item, or what is characteristic of that type of work performed. And so this gave us a set of labeled anomalies in order to perform supervised model training. And so that moves us on to model training and testing. We utilize 3 separate model architectures or types of models, those 3 being the random forest, the gradient boosted tree, and the support vector machine, or the SVM. We chose these model architectures because they're well understood and broadly available in packages such as Python scikit-learn, and they're also available in the R language. We really also wanted to understand which architectures will work best in our scenario. And given that this is a new type of problem and a new way of working for us, we also wanted to get an understanding of how much of our performance is impacted by the model architecture versus the strategy that we're using to select the modeling data or generate the synthetic data. And so we utilize SME knowledge as well as Shapley additive explanations, or SHAP, to perform our feature selection. And our features are both a mix of legal case level features as well as line item level features, meaning we have both characteristics of the overall legal case, which might have many invoices and many hundreds or thousands of individual line items, as well as characteristics of the line item itself, such as the type of work that's being performed. There was a heavy focus throughout this project on feature engineering. In hindsight, I believe that was the correct choice. It's really something that drove our model performance and helped improve our results, in my opinion. Something that going forward, we'll focus on as well. And so that moves us on to how we performed our experiments and how we performed our evaluation. First, we use the first 80% of the data. We use that for model training, with the last 20% used for testing. And this follows, kind of mimics the chronological approach that would happen in the real world, where we'd have a model that is online and having been trained on historical data. It's predicting on some new data that's coming in, and ever so often it will be periodically retrained. And so we use time series cross-validation in order to validate our results. We identified some suitable model parameters, through using a grid search, nothing too complicated. And how we went about training was that 5% of the data used in model training, contained synthetically generated anomalies. And so we had a lot of class imbalance here, and we didn't know how much that would impact our model training. However, it is representative of the real world, and so we decided to, just go ahead and go for it and see, how we do. And so these models were assessed according to the following metrics: the precision, the recall, F1 score, accuracy, and coverage. And in this case, we define coverage as the ratio of examples or samples which fall above a specified prediction confidence threshold, which we set to 90%. And so now that brings us to our results, and then I'll go into kind of a summary and conclude our work. And so here's a table, which includes our qualitative metrics. And so this table contains a comparison between the performance of the various model architectures that we used on the data. And recall that only 5% of the data represents anomalies. In terms of the F1 score, we'll see that the support vector machine was the overall, best performer. However, one might want to consider the computational expense of, training these models. The random forest and the gradient boosted tree were very rapid to train, while the support vector machine, took quite some time to train. And we can see that it only marginally improves over the random forest classifier in terms of F1 score. However, if you want to, maximize recall, and might want to still go with the support vector machine because it is vastly outperforms some of the others. That being said, with high recall and low precision, might have a large number of false positives. In that case, if you wanted to minimize the number of false positives, you'd go with the gradient boosted tree, which has a very high precision, but misses some of the anomalies that it might be able to detect. So these models all have trade-offs, and going through the various architectures allowed us to get an understanding of what those trade-offs would be. And so that brings us to our findings and some of our lessons learned. So we achieved relatively good performance across all the model types. It's just that the behavior of that performance varied depending on the model type, whether precision was maximized or recall was maximized. We did find, however, that feature engineering throughout this whole process provided us with the best bang for the buck, as mentioned earlier. And this is somewhere where we'll focus on again in the future. We really feel like this work can improve existing e-billing systems to detect this specific type of anomaly or the lifecycle anomalies. And we've learned that and believe that future strategies towards model training can be made in the future so that other models can be brought online to detect other types of anomalies, which otherwise might be not caught or not found by the current e-billing systems. Further, we really developed a further expertise and knowledge of the legal invoice data and what can be done with it. And we find that that will be invaluable in working with our clients going forward. With that, I want to say thank you. We had an excellent time working on this project, and I want to thank the organizers of the Industrial Conference on Data Mining, ICDM 2021, for putting on the conference, reviewing our work, and graciously inviting us to present our work here. If you'd like to get in contact with myself or Mori and in general learn about the work that we're doing, please email us here at info@infiniglobe.com or reach out at the phone number and the address there.